Okay, so Chapter 4 is the biggest part of this whole class so far. Okay, we're going to review Chapter 4, and then my screen is doing somewhere. And then you have the test on Thursday, and then Friday and Monday we'll do 1, and then 2 and 3. I think it's probably the way it'll break out. So, although, and on the final, really, this is going to have probably more questions than the other ones, but the other ones, that's not true. Chapter 1 is very long. Is that the little tiny fly you're worried about?
I don't know. Where did you see a fly at?
Well, it's little tiny.
Hey, you know we have 2 white days in a row?
Yeah, I know. That's why we're going to review Friday and Monday.
Why didn't they just
It works out fine.
Why didn't they just leave the
Why don't they
week
just do a
schedule
problem
alone
and
and then make Friday you sit in class and do nothing day?
That doesn't make any sense, does it? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the stuff we went over way back. Okay, beginning of the class. Chapter 4 is about the motherboard to include the CPU. Okay, they're both together. So everything we've done on motherboards and CPUs all comes together. Okay, we have to understand what the from when we did the motherboard project. Okay, and I hopefully have some pictures coming up here in a second. Things we need to know about the motherboard. In fact, let's just go ahead and break. Okay, so what's the purpose of the motherboard?
How's the CPU?
Okay, it's number one to house the CPU and then to
Communicate with all the other devices.
make it connect up with everything else. Okay, the main purpose of the motherboard is to connect everything up with our CPU, which is why this book grouped those two things together. Okay, because the motherboard is pointless of the CPU and vice versa. Okay, so things we need to know about the motherboard in general. It syncs up. Okay, it connects everything up with the CPU. The CPU does the majority of the processing, right? So everything needs to talk to the CPU. Motherboard talks at its own speed. How is that speed rated, first of all? In what?
Gigahertz.
Okay, in specifically in hertz, or what's a hertz?
Cycles.
A cycle per second. Okay, and now I'm going to deviate because you're going to have a question on this. Okay, hertz is 1 cycle per second. How much is a kilohertz?
1,000.
1,000. How much is a megahertz? 1,000,000. How much is a gigahertz?
A billion.
A billion. Now there's no terahertz. We don't go that fast yet. Okay, so but we need to be able to match those. I guarantee there'll be a matching question. It's really a metric question. Okay, hertz is 1. A kilohertz is 1,000.
Exit.
A megahertz is 1,000,000. Remember the M's, so it's a good way to remember it. A gigahertz is 1 billion cycles per second, and then a terahertz is 1 trillion, but we really don't make anything that goes that fast just right now. Okay. Okay, we do have terabytes of storage though. We have terabyte hard drives. Okay. So that's going to end up being on the test somewhere, okay? But our motherboard speed is rated in hertz, and specifically, normally, we see it in either mega or gigahertz. We see it in one of those two ways. And when we say that, we say cycles per second, what specifically controls how many cycles per second? This was on a quiz. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. The external clock pulses to control the flow of information around the motherboard. So it all goes, go, go. Think of it like that, except for it happens really fast, okay? So that was a true or false question on some quiz. Was it on this quiz you just took, or was it a quiz a while ago?
I was on the motherboard. Or no?
I think both.
Motherboard.
It was on both? Okay, so if you see that question, the external clock is what controls those pulses or that speed, okay? So when we're talking motherboard, usually it's in megahertz or gigahertz, okay? And everything syncs up with that as information flows around the motherboard. When the information flows around the motherboard, there's two things controlling the flow of information around the motherboard. What are those two things?
The front side bus and the
Okay. Not really what I'm looking for. Okay. It's two things that control flow of information around the motherboard.
The south bridge and north bridge.
Okay, we got two chipsets, the north bridge and the south bridge. Okay, so we have two chipsets on the motherboard that control information. We got what's called the north and the south bridge. Okay, or the north and the south bus. They both still go at that same speed, whatever speed the motherboard is going at. Okay? But that's what controls the information as it goes around the motherboard. And I know I'm way deviating from my own PowerPoint, but I'll just do it hard. Okay, so the north one, remember, if you look at it, has a big, huge honking CPU or heatsink on it, usually on new ones, right? Because it controls the most amount of information, because it controls the CPUs talking to what? Two things.
RAM.
Okay, it controls how the CPU talks to RAM or memory. And what else? What else does the CPU talk to on the north bridge? And it's where majority information goes.
Video from it?
And our video, okay? All these things you might want to make sure in your note while we're going through things. So you have your notebook out and sitting right in front of you.
I have a notebook.
Okay, I know, and it's
Okay.
sitting right in front of you, and
Isn't
it's
it
not
impressive?
open. Okay, so the north bridge has the CPU, is where the CPU talks to the memory and the video card. Okay, and it's where a majority of information moves, because we know that the CPU swaps information back and forth between the cache and RAM thousands, if not millions of times a second. Okay, and then we've got the south bridge, and what's on the south bridge? Everything else. Okay, so when I'm looking at that motherboard, got the CPU, the north bridge controls information that goes to the RAM and the video card. The south bridge controls everything else as it goes back to that CPU. Okay. What else? What's the biggest thing that syncs up in the same speed as the motherboard itself? What was that? One other thing that syncs up with the speed of the motherboard. One other thing that syncs up at the exact speed. The RAM goes the exact same speed as the motherboard itself. Okay? And that's because it's where all that information is going back and forth from the CPU. So the motherboard and the RAM work at the exact same speed, talking back to the CPU. Now, one of the things that we brought up is a logical place is bottleneck. What is CPU bottleneck?
The CPU goes way faster than the motherboard.
Okay, it's a bottleneck because the CPU is way faster than the motherboard. A typical good CPU right now, what was the speed of your gamer CPU?
Overclocked or not?
Not.
4 gigahertz.
Okay, so you had a 4.0 gigahertz CPU. Okay, what was the speed of your gamer motherboard?
That wasn't my game.
No, that was the
No.
CPU.
Okay.
That was the CPU. I will venture a guess that it was somewhere around 1600 megahertz, not overclocked. That's a standard, really fast memory speed right now. There are faster, it might have been as high as 2100 megahertz. But non-overclocked, there isn't any higher than that. So even if it was the best one, if it was 2100 megahertz, how much faster is the CPU? How many times faster, if I said round to the whole number?
Well, the first one was 250 times.
No? Anyone else got a better one? This is in gigahertz, this is in megahertz. Convert to the same number, that equals 2.1 gigahertz. How much faster is the CPU than the motherboard? 2 times. I said round to the nearest whole number. It's 2 times faster, okay? Because I'm not going to have 1.4762. I'm going to say, is it 1? Is it? And this will be on a test. I said, I'm going to give you, go to this motherboard, go to the CPU. What's the bottleneck? And the answer is going to be like, the CPU is 2 times faster, the CPU is 4 times faster, the CPU is 6 times faster. And in this case, if I gave you this, the CPU is 2 times faster than the memory, than the motherboard, and that's the bottleneck. Nico is really, 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 really fast, but unfortunately, he's batting behind somebody else. Okay?
Nobody calls someone slow.
And I know, I was thinking about it. I was going to name a name, but it's going to be online, and I wasn't going to throw out his table partner's name. So, anyways, so I mean, think about it. If you're sitting here and you hit a triple and I'm running behind somebody else who's really slow, that's a bottleneck. I have to stay one base behind him no matter what, right? Because you can't pass in baseball. So that would be an example of a bottleneck. The CPU can only get information out and back so fast if the motherboard's twice as slow. Okay, so that's CPU bottleneck. Because I'm going to ask that on the test. Okay, then we've got all these components. I'm going to go back to my presentation.
So many emails?
What?
Why do you send so many emails?
Because I want you to do something and you don't read it. Okay, so we've got our motherboard. We need to be able to recognize stuff that's on our motherboard. Let me go to a newer picture, hopefully. There we go. Okay. So that's why I have that one on the quiz. You need to be able to look at stuff and recognize. How do I recognize the difference between the power connector and the ID connector? It's the size of the holes. The holes are way bigger on the power connector. And when you're on the quiz, just some quizmanship for you. If I'm sitting here on this quiz, and I ask you something on this, don't be afraid to do this. To right click and go view image. And then zoom into the image if you need to, if the picture doesn't seem big enough, okay? Which one of those is the power connector and which one is the IDE? The IDE one has pins. It doesn't even have holes. And the power connector has those big holes. So if you're taking the quiz, you can also just, do you guys know how to scroll roll do this?
Yeah, I can never seem
control
to get it back to the first one.
Huh?
I can never seem to get it back.
You hit Control 0 and it takes it back to the first where it was. That's the reset. If you didn't know that. So if I'm here and I hit Control 0, look, voila.
That's amazing.
It's magic. Okay, so don't be afraid to zoom in. And sometimes the picture gets bigger. Let's see if I can go to another one that the picture actually gets bigger when I zoom into it. Did I make these going up in random order? I did. So that's not helping me out. Because sometimes I shrunk down the picture, and if you right click and say view image, it might be bigger. It's not really any bigger. So. Okay, anyway. The other thing is when I'm doing these, if I ask you a question on one, there's very possible that I'm asking you to actually look at what kind of motherboard it is. Not that this one is this, but it might say like MSI blah 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 on the motherboard. So if I ask you a question on a motherboard that you're like, there's no way I could ever know this, Mr. Poole, that's crazy, I may be asking you to actually look at the, let me see if I can find one that's a good picture equivalent. That one's too out of focus. I guarantee you there'll be at least one, this is obviously not the final thing. There'll be at least one where I ask you about a motherboard, and any with good pictures in this quiz. That one didn't have it. That
There's
one.
the one with the Asus one.
I don't. Do I? Do I have one with a better overhead picture? I don't. But basically, what I'm asking you to do is read the name of the motherboard and actually Google that information. Okay. So when I ask you, how fast is this motherboard, and I just show you a picture with no link, the answer's in the picture. I'm expecting you to Google MSI whatever. Don't say, I don't know what this motherboard is, because I'm not going to help you. Sometimes the answer is right on the picture of the motherboard. Okay? Maybe I've got that on this one. Yeah, I don't. We'll go to another picture that I'll show you an example. So I need to be able to identify these things. Nobody has a problem identifying the memory, the CPU socket. This one, because it's is this PGA or LGA? Okay, it's PGA. It's got pinholes. Because it's PGA, it's most likely for AMD. If it's LGA, it's most likely for Intel. Okay, and I have to change my questions to say most likely for, because we learned that there are LGA sockets on AMDs, but just not that many. Put my pin down out. There it is. Okay. So, and here's our North Bridge or North Bus or North chipset. It's under the bigger heat sink right there. Okay, that's why that other heat sink is on there. Other hard drive connectors besides the PATA or IDE header, we've got the SATA ones, and I might ask you a question, how many SATA hard drives can I connect to this motherboard? I'm asking you to count. And I guarantee you it will be a motherboard that doesn't have them hidden. Some of you guys have motherboards where they went off to the side, right? And you didn't see, you couldn't, it was kind of hard to count. This one would be easy to count. How many are there, Nico? 6. Okay, that's the, and what am I really, I'm not asking if you can count. By asking that question, I'm asking if you know that those are the SATA headers, and then you count them, okay? So that shouldn't be overly hard. And this line, if you can't see, it says Northbridge chipset, it comes over here. Okay, and other things. I'm going to ask you how many PCI. If I'm saying PCI, I mean standard PCI. These are the standard PCI. If I say PCI Express, these are all PCI Express, but I may say how many PCI Express 1 slots are. The answer to that is, cool, Cody, how many PCI Express 1 slots are on here? 2, right? I got to count my little ones. If I say how many PCI Express 16 slots, Casey? 2. Okay, that's all I'm asking you to do is to count those things up. Okay? And you need to be able to recognize that, which hopefully by now, from our PowerPoints and stuff, that we can all recognize those things that are on the motherboard. Okay, here's another. This is a perfect example of one. Let's see, does this even have the name?
Yeah.
Where's it at? Well, I know it's a gigabyte, but I'm looking for. Here's a good question that I could ask with this one. What is it? Speed of the memory, or what kind of memory does this motherboard take?
I can't read.
Okay, it says DDR2 1200/1066. Okay, and it even says what the front side bus speed is. That must be 1600. I need a better picture because that definitely says 1600. 1233 is what it says, multi-core CPU. Okay, if I said how many SATA hard drives can I connect up to this one, the answer would be 6. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't see any more on there. I've got, here's my IDE connector, it's turned sideways. There's my floppy drive connector. How do I tell the difference between an IDE and a floppy connector? Yeah, just from looking, how can I tell the difference? Okay, it's got this, just so you know, this one has 40 and that has 34, so this one's always smaller. If I had to, and I was looking at it and I was like, I don't know, is that a floppy drive? I could actually go like this and hold it up to my screen and actually figure out if it's the same thing. Because you can have 2 of these, right? You can have 2 of these, you can have 1 of those. How do I know which one's which? That's how I know which
I
one's
don't
which.
like when the motherboards like that.
What?
I don't like when the motherboards like
You don't like when it's turned that way? I think it's hard to plug stuff in. I don't either.
that. I don't.
I try not to choose motherboards with the connector is pointing out, because it's really hard to get into it unless you've got a case that's made specifically for it.
I just like it because the way the picture is.
Okay, how many PCI Express 1 slots do we have, Miss Simpson?
No.
Are you Miss Simpson? Miss Simpson,
What'd you ask?
how many PCI Express 1 slots do we have?
Oh.
I
You
don't
named it.
Sorry, I can't see those.
They're hard to
I said
see.
that.
Yeah, that one you put on that other quiz. They're like.
I only see the blue and the
You
white.
gotta look, you gotta zoom in.
I said
Okay?
3.
Don't be afraid to zoom in.
Well, I don't have the thing in my hand. I couldn't zoom in right there.
know you couldn't. I didn't give you 0 or anything for it.
She's going to too. She's tired too.
Okay. If I ask what is underneath this, what would be the answer? CPU. What is this specifically?
I was gonna say heatsink.
It's the heatsink, right? Okay, yeah, if you said the heatsink is underneath the fan, that would, okay. So this is the CPU heatsink. Because the CPU creates a lot of heat, we watch the video on the CPU exploding if the heatsink's not on there. This is listing what? Form factors, okay? Different form factors. Of the form factors, there's really, and we said this before, there's really only one that's in use. I guess mini ATX, the same thing. ATX form factor, we talked about how that describes the size and shape of components. There is no AT stuff anymore. Fortunately, I don't have a newer slide, okay? 3 things that rate CPUs. are the cache, speed or frequency, okay, and then the number of cores. The number of cores determine the speed of our CPUs, okay? And I guarantee you I will be giving you a link or just the name. Hey, I'm looking at the Intel, let's say AMD FX 6400X2. I was wondering how many cores it has. I'm going to expect you to go and look it up at the site or to Google it, okay? That's why it has to be open internet. We don't, I actually did have one of these. They don't make those processors anymore. Just really AMD and Intel are the only two processor makers anymore. And you guys know there's two different kinds of sockets. There's PGA and there's LGA. And PGA are also ZIF sockets, which stands for Zero Insertion Force, okay? Meaning you don't push it in and just drop it in the holes when you put it down in there. There's a picture of an old, very old AMD one, and there's a nice fan. I've got one looks a lot like that on mine. Okay, we have to have heat sinks on ours. They may come with them, they may not. Processor connects to the motherboard via the socket. A lot of this stuff you guys know. Okay, and we've got really LGA and PGA sockets. Those other kind of sockets are old socket stuff. We talked about already about what the chipsets do and how they control the flow of information around the motherboard. BIOS. We talked about that since chapter 1. Okay, BIOS is stored on RAM or ROM. All right, it's obviously on this thing over here. So question. Okay, stored on ROM. I go into BIOS. BIOS stands for the Basic and Input Output System. Is how we set up stuff on our computer, how we tell it the boot order, and then we save the boot order. It saves it into no, not that. Doesn't save it in the battery. The CMOS battery goes into CMOS RAM. Okay, that configuration is stored in CMOS RAM. And there's lots of different BIOSes out there. We've played with them before. Okay. These are the different kinds of expansion slots. You guys know the current ones now, okay? Really, the current ones are PCI and PCI Express, and there's a couple different kinds of PCI Express. You've got the 1, you've got the 2, you've got the 4, you've got the 8, you've got the 16. But realistically, most motherboards only have the 1, 8, or 16. I haven't seen one that has the other ones in like forever. And when we hook them in, we just push them down in the slot, right? And then we have to install the what? What do we have to install after we put something in? The drivers, okay? So let's not forget what drivers are. What are drivers? Okay, drivers are programs that make hardware work. And I'm really not talking about chapter 4 when I say that. That's a chapter 2 question, okay? I don't even want to mention that one. Okay, so one of the questions that Casey asked the other day, there was a picture with stuff pointing to it. There were, she said, what are those? Oh, there's our CMOS battery. When it was pointing to these on the motherboard, those actually look like the USB connectors, but they're ones just like that on the motherboard that are the front panel connectors that you have to plug stuff into in order to make these buttons and the USB and stuff on the front of our computer work too. I'm not really going to ask you this right now. We talked about this when we were talking about BIOS, but you know there are different things that come up, different sounds that the motherboard makes when it's got problems booting, things like the sound when there isn't any memory in. What are the indications that we talked about before of a bad power supply and stuff too? Okay, let's talk about questions that you guys have. In fact, let's go to that. Let's go to the quiz and see how we did on that. Okay, I'm going to turn this back on here. Okay, so everybody feels like they can look at a motherboard and know the basic parts to match that around. I can look at a motherboard sales site and determine the speeds and usage of the motherboard. And when I say usage, I'm saying comparing it to that list that I gave you on the PowerPoint. So when you go and look at it, if I were to, we're just going to randomly go to one right now, okay? As if, let's just go to New Egg and pick out a motherboard, and I hate when Google does it to me. It's just my link. Okay, let's see. We're going to go to a motherboard.
done.
And we're gonna go to Intel motherboards. I'm just gonna pick the third one down. We'll go to this one right here. Okay, so when I go to that, the first thing you want to look at is those things that limit it from being a choice for something else. So the first limiting thing was that it had to have a gigabit LAN. So when I go down here, I look at the network. Where's the video? Okay, so this has gigabit, so I could use this one for any of the three, okay? So the next thing that was limiting was it had to have the right number of SATAs. I could use that for any of the three. And then it had to have 2 PCI Express. It does. It's got 2 PCI Express 16 slots. This one looks like it goes 32 gig of RAM. This one looks like a good choice for the gamer one. Okay. I picked a relatively decent one for that. Let's see. Let's see our picture. Zoom into our picture. Okay. Oop. It does have integrated video, but it hit every other point. So if you said gamer or business, it would be good for either one. It's not a home, because home was about cheap. How much is this one? $159. Not the cheapest. This is a pretty good price, actually, really. Okay, so but that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to look and say which one do you think this would be the best for. And realistically, looking at this one really quickly, I would say this would be a decent gamer PC motherboard. And I will try, and I'm not going to pick them out that randomly. I'm going to try to pick one that is definitely, you know, it's only got 100 meg LAN. So you're like, well, this one has to be for home because it was required to be gigabit for the other ones, okay? So hopefully you'll be able to figure out those pretty easily. I can explain the speeds of the motherboard front side bus, okay? That's the speed that stuff moves around the bus. It syncs up with the memory. And that's what determines our bottleneck. The difference between that speed and our CPU speed is what determines our bottleneck. Can you guys figure that out? Remember that one's usually in gigahertz and one's usually in megahertz. So the first thing you gotta do is convert. Okay? So when you go and look at a site, I'm not gonna say I guarantee, but usually the motherboard is listed as something, or the memory speed will say something like 1600 megahertz. And the CPU is going to say something like 3.2 gigahertz. Well, to convert, you just move over 3 decimal places. So this is 1.6 gigahertz. What's the bottleneck? 2, okay? CPU is twice as fast as the motherboard, okay? So you guys need to be able to do that math too when you take the test. I can match the CPU with the appropriate motherboard, give the CPU type and internet access. In other words, what I'm saying is, I found this CPU and I found this motherboard. Can I use them? You have to look at, number one, what's the first thing I have to look at?
CPU, like the 1155.
I have to look at the socket type, okay? They both have to have the exact same socket. Don't just look at the motherboard and say it takes Intel. This is an Intel CPU. I guarantee you I'm going to give one that's a 2011 and an 1155. Or 750, 775. They're not going to match. Okay? Or one of them's going to be 1155, one of them's going to be 1156. They're really close. It doesn't work. Okay? So I'm asking you to actually look and say, will this go with this? You look at the motherboard, it says what it takes. You look at the CPU, is it one of those? It has to match the socket, and it has to be on that list of processors. Okay? If I give you a standard motherboard that says it's an LGA 1155, and then I give you a Xeon processor that says it's something else, you're like, no. Okay, they don't go there. So that's what I'm saying. You guys need to be able to make sure that you can buy. I mean, that's one of the things with this course. When you leave this course, should you be able to buy all the parts and build your own PC? Yes, you should. Okay, should you be able to open up your PC and upgrade your own processor and memory? Yes, you should. Which is really easy. You know, when we get down to it, upgrading your memory is as simple as could be. You know, Best Buy will charge you $40 to go geek, push it in. I can use the BIOS of various systems to configure CMOS. Now, there's no way for us to actually practice that on a test. There's no way for me to give you BIOS. I basically want to know that you say I can either hit delete or F1 or F2, whatever comes up on the screen, to go into it and change the boot order. I can explain what L1, L2, and L3 cache is. It is memory. It's memory. Okay, it's memory that the CPU uses. It's really fast. The more cache I have, the faster the CPU makes the system go, and that's because of that bottleneck. If I put 32 gig of RAM in here, but I have a CPU with no internal cache, it's still going to seem really sucky. But if I got half that amount of RAM on the motherboard, but I have a CPU that has tons of cache, it's going to go a lot faster because it doesn't have to go to the memory. Okay? I can find the specifications of the CPU on the manufacturer's website. Hopefully you guys can do that. That when I say, hey, I've got this CPU, and I'm going to say how much cache does it have, or how much L3 cache does it have, or how much total cache does it have, something like that. I'm going to ask you some specific question. You just need to find it on the website and pick out the right answer. There's a lot of research on this test. There's a lot of looking up. That's why it has to be open internet, because there's no way with motherboards and CPUs, really for a lot of this stuff, anyone would ever know. I guess you, for the designer for Intel, you might know it, but then you wouldn't be in this class. Okay, we can discuss the different CPU manufacturers and understand how they use different motherboards. Okay, basically it's just saying, do you understand that they have to match, the CPU has to match the socket, but it doesn't have to be by the same manufacturer, right? We know that BioStar makes motherboards for with AMD and Intel, and they make them a whole bunch of different sockets. You just need to be able to match those things up. Is there anything you guys feel like, I wish I knew, I don't know, I'm not ready for that test on Thursday? Anything that's particularly confusing or anything? Because you don't want to answer questions during tests. So you don't want to wait till the test to ask the question.
Am I your favorite student?
No.
Told ya.
Is that a no, you're not going to answer it? Or
No, she is.
She is.
She's got the girlfriend's face on. She's going to smile by the end of the day. Somebody's going to come up and give her a hug.
No, she won't. She's gonna take a nap by the end of the day, and then she'll be.
And then she's just tired. Okay, let's see. Anything else that we didn't go over? I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything else on this review, and I need to change this PowerPoint anyway because it's got a bunch of junk that I don't like on it. That's from the textbook, and I don't like that very much.
Can't stop her.
Anything else? I can't think of anything else.